You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Steven Jay Rubin. Today, we look at the wonderful world of Disney. And now, here's Steve.
Hi, guys. So I have to tell you a story. A guy sends me a screenplay, and it takes place in the 56th century, so about 3,000 years from now. And there's only one company in Hollywood. Everything's been merged into one company. There's one company making all the entertainment. And all the actors, by the way, are slaves. They work for this company. And nobody goes to the movies or watches TV anymore. Everything's projected into your dreams. So these actors have to be slaves. Now, I'm not saying that Disney will enslave actors. But if ever there was a story where one company took over all of Hollywood, I would predict it would be Disney. What do you think?
I thought it was Engulf and Devour.
Engulf and Devour?
Which was from Silent Movie. Hello, Mel Brooks.
Ah.
Company was called Engulf and Devour. I think Disney is, I don't know. I can tell you that they own what they own. What the Bob Iger put together was a masterpiece.
Think of a company that owns Pixar and Marvel and what's the other big one? Is it DreamWorks?
Lucas?
Lucasfilm. Excuse me, Lucasfilm. They have plucked assets from the heavens, actually. But I thought it would be important for us to do a Disney Day, because how can you talk about show business without talking heavily into Disney?
And it all started with a mouse.
It actually started with a rabbit, actually. I did a little digging, and Walt Disney's first animated creation was Oswald Rabbit. This goes
Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, actually.
I don't think it was his creation, Steve. I think he was hired by Universal to work on Oswald, but I don't think he created it. His first creation, I believe, was Mortimer Mouse, which became Mickey Mouse.
Thanks to his wife. Yeah, Mortimer she thought was too pompous. But yeah. Disney is very special to me because I arrived in California from Chicago. I arrived in LA in November 1955. Disneyland had opened in July. So the first thing I remember in Southern California practically is my parents taking me to Disneyland. I was probably 4. I could barely walk by then. And I tell you, I remember the little ticket book that you got with the E tickets, the B tickets, the A tickets, the C tickets. I didn't look up what it cost to enter Disneyland in 1955, but I bet it was something like $10.
If that.
It's an interesting story of a man. I guess anybody who's really successful, it's quite interesting to study their life. And in Disney's case, he did not have an easy beginning. He was with a very cold father who, so much so that he didn't even go to his father's funeral. He had to do newspaper deliveries. He'd get up at 4:30 in the morning and have this incredible route that he would take, selling newspapers. He was a shy and an insecure boy, as it's been said, but he started drawing. He started drawing watercolors and with crayons, and he became a commercial illustrator for theater and for many things. It was a long struggle before he and his brother Roy opened up the Disney studio. And in those days, animation was all being done in New York, was not being done in California. And rather interesting, one of the major reasons the Disneys moved to California was that his brother Roy had TB. He had tuberculosis. and he needed that kind of climate, a much warmer climate, more than where they were in New York and even in Chicago. So it's an interesting beginning. And there's a wonderful line in Shakespeare where Iago in Othello says, "I am not what I am." And I think as we start to study Disney, his persona, as in many famous people, are not necessarily who they are. He was known as Uncle Walt, and we'll talk a little bit about Uncle Walt, but I've talked enough, so I'll hand it over to my friends.
Well, wouldn't you say that virtually every human being's persona is not exactly what you think it is?
I think we are complex. I think
Dr.
all
Jekyll
human
and
beings
Mr.
are complex.
Hyde was but a metaphor. I mean, they took it to the extent of total madness. But we're all kind of different than people think. But nonetheless, Walt Disney was in fact a genius, and I believe he was a genius of simplicity. If you go through everything that this guy did, it was kind of simplistic, but it was, what's the difference? It doesn't have to be complex.
Well, yeah, I think his first assignment was on a farm. I guess the family briefly moved to a farm, and Walt was asked to draw a picture of a horse for a neighbor. And I think that started introducing him to the idea of doing illustration. And I think if you think about it, a lot of Disney's work has a pastoral quality about it. He seemed to love the woods and the woodlands, and of course, animated characters thrive in the woods. I'm of course reminded of Bambi. How can you not be reminded of Bambi?
Though, Steve, my theory on Walt Disney is clear, and it developed really early, but it came totally clear to me the first time I took my little daughter to Disneyland. Once entering Disneyland, I realized I get it. I understand what this guy was all about. And what he was about was Americana, probably out of the early 1900s. But Disneyland, for everybody who's been there, in its most simple form, is Americana, is peaceful. There was a great show once on Twilight Zone, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I think it was called Last Stop or Next Stop Willoughby. And Willoughby was this place of peace, of quiet, of tranquility, of
an idyllic town.
Until what's Julian?
An idyllic town. I remember
an idyllic
it well.
town. Yes.
The title was A Stop at Willoughby.
Okay. Well, that's what I thought of when I first went to Disneyland. It had that beautiful, peaceful feeling about it, with games and all the rest that goes with it. But today, Steve, could you comment perhaps on what it does cost to go to Disneyland today?
I don't even.
Well,
I was there last year, and I didn't bring the family. I'm going to say that it was $100 a piece. That's probably low.
Low.
Yeah,
that's real low.
Yeah, I think that. But I agree with you about Americana. I remember my first trip to Disneyland at that time in '55. I remember Frontierland with the riverboats. I think they were called. What were they called? Well, there was a riverboat and that took you around Tom Sawyer Island. Oh, they were called flatboats, not flatboats. Anyway, the whole thing about the fort and being able to defend it against Indians. They called them Indians in those days, of course, because it was not very PC. And walking around Main Street, to this day, one of my favorite times in Disneyland is walking around Main Street with the streetcars and storefronts. It was beautiful, but it's interesting. I was also thinking today before the podcast about merchandising. I know that merchandising did not start with Walt Disney and Disneyland, but you got to figure that Disney was probably the shrewdest person in terms of getting his material into products.
One of the reasons he got involved with merchandising, he was not a very good businessman. Roy Disney was the businessman. He got into it because they were ripping off the Mickey Mouse logos, pictures, and they had no right. People had no rights. So that's why he got into it. It wasn't that he was thinking how great merchandising could be, but it sure turned out to be. But back to Disneyland, it took him 15 years to do this. This was not an overnight thing or a year or two. He worked on it and really wanted something that was good for adults and good for children. They had Griffith Park, as you guys know, but that wasn't anywhere near what he had in mind. It was closer to Tivoli. If you've ever been to Copenhagen and seen the Tivoli Gardens, that's really what Disneyland is a lot based on.
Had he been there, Julian?
I don't know if he had. I would assume he may have, Arthur, but whether he had or not, he knew of it because Tivoli was so gorgeous.
Yeah.
It cost, at that time, Disneyland cost $17 million, they say, to build. And it was a lot of money in those days. And it was, look, he wanted to build originally in Burbank, but it wasn't big enough. That's how Anaheim came into it.
Well, there was an ongoing joke on the Jack Benny radio show, which was the guy with the doing the train announcement. Next train for Anaheim, Azusa, and Cucamonga. And Cucamonga became the joke. But the fact is, Anaheim was really hardly heard of.
That's right.
He found it. You go there today, and my God, what has been built around Anaheim? There's millions of people there.
When we drove out to Anaheim in '55, it was all orange groves between downtown LA practically and Anaheim. And it seemed to take forever. I remember being in the car forever. It was probably 40 minutes. He or Roy got the ABC network to invest in Disneyland. That was the deal. They would invest in Disneyland and he would do shows on ABC. And of course, we all know the shows like the Mickey Mouse Club, the Davy Crockett. I mean, these were huge, giant shows, and that was the quid pro quo between ABC and Disney.
It's not that legend has it, but what you said, I understand is totally true, and that is he was just not a business person at all. He was a dreamer.
That's right.
It took his brother, Roy, to make those dreams come true. But Walt Disney was the ultimate dreamer, and his dreams did come true. And what happened down here in Florida, they replicated Disneyland in Orlando. Orlando became the Anaheim of Florida, and they took orange groves again in southern Florida, in mid-Florida, and you should see it today. It's, again, a city of millions of people.
Well, the amount of acreage that they got when they built Disney World was, immense. They haven't even come close to developing all the property that Disney owns yet. And that's just, there's just so much more because Walt had so many visions for what he wanted to do at Disney World. He wanted to do a replica of the Magic Kingdom like over in California, but he also wanted to create Epcot, but not the Epcot we got. Epcot originally was supposed to be this huge, modern, futuristic planned community that, he had, that not just employees would work on, but everyday people would work on. And it would have, underground parking. It would have monorails connecting people and people movers. It would be state-of-the-art technology and constantly upgrading as they went through. And the models you could see, they're still on display. You could find them out there. And it's just Walt, like you said, Walt was a visionary, but he barely lived to be able to see Disney World open.
Yeah.
In fact, it opened after he died. I think about the monopoly Disney had on children's programming. I mean, there were other filmmakers who were making films for young people, but nobody created the franchise that Disney became. I mean, the concept of doing a feature-length animated film was very novel in 1937 when Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out. Some people felt it was, I think they referred to it as Disney's folly. They thought people would not sit still for a feature-length cartoon. And boy,
let
were they
alone in
proof
color. Let alone in color.
In Technicolor. And
right. He had a very good philosophy, and as Arthur has said more than once, and correctly, he was a dreamer, but he also had a very simple philosophy. He said, kids don't have money. Parents do. I better make films for both, not just for the kids, but for both. And that was the whole dream of Disneyland itself. The idea that it ended up, I think it was something like 4 adults to every child would go to Disneyland. 4 adults to every child. You wouldn't believe that, but that's exactly supposedly the truth.
Yeah.
I was going to say Snow White, as we pointed out, was the very first color feature. He did the first music with cartoon folks. He did the first dialogue, sound with cartoons. So he was the man. The only other person, I guess, that I can think of, maybe Walter Lantz, would you say, and...
one of his competitors early on who just fell by the wayside was Max Fleischer. Max Fleischer did some amazing animated films, particularly involving Superman. And
Out of the Inkwell.
Yes, Out of the Inkwell. You had, and it was interesting because you had Merry Melodies, you had all these different animated shorts, Terry Toons too, exactly. And it was amazing because Warner Brothers, you had all these small little studios, and then they started getting gobbled up by the big movie studios and everything.
But early on, no one really believed. Everybody thought he was crazy. They thought this whole idea of feature-length animated movies were not going to work. Of course, they did, but the people who were saying that, their grandsons or sons and granddaughters and what have you, who came to lead the industry, were saying that through the 80s. This animated movies are dead. It's gone. So it happened a second time in the 90s, and now they're bigger than ever. Disney's are bigger than ever. They just opened up a movie called Inside Out or something.
Inside Out 2 opened today, actually, as of a recording date, and that's a Pixar. But Pixar
is Disney.
Disney originally it wasn't. It got bought out.
I know, I understand that, but it's under the Disney banner. The point of this is that, again, who's coming to see these movies? Not only the kids, but like Julian said, the parents bring the kids because they get the money to pay, and parents sit and love these things.
Well, listen.
Watch some of these movies; they're fantastic.
Pixar has been a godsend for parents because I personally had little kids back in the 90s, and I had I had the pleasure of taking my kids to see the Barney movie, which to me is the equivalent of hell. And I had to sit there for 90 minutes and watch that purple dinosaur. And then Toy Story came out, one of the first Pixar productions, and it was a great breath of fresh air. But I want to go back to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937. Huge hit. Huge hit. However, the 2 films that followed, Pinocchio, Fantasia, were not successes. I think they were both released in 1940, and Disney immediately got into some financial difficulties. Even Dumbo, which I believe was released in 42 during the war, just did okay. So it was a constant battle to stay physically afloat, which I'm sure, as Julian has pointed out, is more Roy's doing than Walt's doing.
Yes.
Well, the thing about Pinocchio and Fantasia led to a lot of animators being fired because they were losing money, as they often had their ups and downs as a company. And the animators, because of that layoff and a lot of other complaints, went on strike in 1941. It was a very tough strike for Disney. So much so because he was enraged. He had felt that he had done great things for a lot of these folks, and they were not being fair to him. Roy convinced him to take a trip to South America, a goodwill tour, and Roy settled the strike, got it settled. But it was something that was rather upsetting for the whole Walt Disney image, and certainly for Disney himself. But they persevered. They went back. The problem had been supposedly this fellow Neil Gabler, who we all know as a film critic and a writer, was given exclusive access to the files of Walt Disney and the company. And he came up with things like, if there was almost a hierarchy. If you were making $100 or more, you were allowed to go to the gym or a special restaurant on Disney. If you weren't, you weren't. It was a lot of kind of elitism that was taking place. All of this got somewhat exploded. One of Disney's big problems, Walt Disney, and understandably so, he had decided to take 20% of all the profits of the short cartoons and put it aside for bonuses for employees. That was pretty unheard of in those days. And that was one of his reasons why he was so upset that they would do that to him, the animators.
I want to be clear on something. Are we suggesting here that Pinocchio was a box office failure? I know Fantasia was basically an art film. It was something that catered to adults and older adults.
Pinocchio was a box office failure, yes.
Wow, I never knew that.
Originally, yes.
Yeah, but as we all know, all these incredible animated movies came back and made profits of gigantic amount of money.
Every 7 years they'd re-release.
Every 7 years, that's right. And the critics of animated films cite Pinocchio as the best animated film ever made. So it turned out not only to be not a loser, it was a winner, but initially it did lose.
What a great movie, and it was terrifying, though. With that whale opened its mouth, my God. But Jiminy Cricket, it's hard to believe that was... So the most successful of the original, is it 7 guys? 7 original...
Well, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was a giant in 1930. Gigantic, one of the largest grossing films of the year, if not the largest grossing. Well, no, it was Shirley Temple in that, probably, because Shirley Temple was amazing. By the way, in mentioning Snow White, I interviewed Marge Champion of Gower, Marge and Gower Champion, a wonderful dancer and an actress of the 50s and 60s. And as a young woman, she was the prototype for Snow White. She would come in and dance in front of the animators, improvise in front of the animators. Originally, the eyes of Snow White were like Betty Boop's. And when they saw Marge, they got much more excited and changed the eyes of Snow White. Marge Champion's father was a very famous choreographer in Los Angeles, worked with Donald O'Connor, but he knew the biggest people. He knew Max Sennett, he knew Cecil B. DeMille, and he knew Walt Disney. And in his school, the father of Marge Champion were the 2 Disney girls also took lessons. And that's how it all came to pass. She also ended up doing the Blue Angel as a figure. And then I think she was one of the hippos. And she wasn't heavy in Fantasia. So
but I recall her the way she looked, and I can see what you're saying about her being a model for Snow White. If you know what she looks like and understand Snow White, I can see that.
Yeah, it's a great history of all these folks, and the more we study it, when we were mentioning the later Disney movies, I fell in love with a movie called Up.
Oh, yeah, I did too. Loved it.
With Ed Asner. I thought, wow, this is a Disney movie, but it was. And $735 million later, a lot of other people felt the same way.
It was funny when we went to go see Up, we had like 10 of us. And in the first 5 minutes, I think all of us were in tears. Uh-huh. Because of the wife passing.
The wife dying, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And all of us were like, And it's like, no, I'm not crying. And Judy was just like, yeah, sure, Mr. Macho.
What a career Ed Asner had. Mary Tyler Moore, Lou Grant, but the lead in Up. And by the way, I think it won a couple of Academy Awards, the movie. I think it did.
Interesting stuff with Disney is that there was always a dark side of whatever these things were. There was always, the thing that would scare kids, like Bambi. Nothing. What more could scare a kid than what happened in Bambi? But that's.
Well, we should just mention, Arthur, quickly that in Bambi, the mother is killed by a hunter.
Well, that's about as frightening as can be, right? Of course.
Well, Disney always had a thing with their animated films that, the parents a lot of times were axed out real quick in the movies, and it's just interesting in the storylines that they did that.
I was at a science fiction convention in 1976, and I saw a short film called Bambi Meets Godzilla.
Oh, Lenny Bruce. That's Lenny Bruce.
I remember that.
It's Lenny Bruce,
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it the little?
That's his routine, and that's where they took it from. Absolutely.
Okay. The short has this little pastoral, beautiful, bucolic music of Bambi grazing, and all of a sudden you hear the sound effect of Godzilla, and a foot comes out and crushes Bambi into dust.
It's funny how the as years went by, and all of a sudden the soft porn industry came into the movie business. They would use a lot of titles from Disney, like Bambi became not the deer, but Bambi became a girl, and Snow White, there was one of those. We had a picture called Alice in Wonderland or something along those lines that was under the banner of Harvey Weinstein. Harvey and Bob Weinstein was there at the beginning, and we represented them. So we had to distribute this. It was soft porn. I'd have to check the title out, but Alice in Wonderland something or another. But it all transformed into this industry. I got to tell you that at the beginning, if you look through the history of Disney pictures, they were a small company. If you were part of Film Row in any city in the United States, there were the big companies, of course, Paramount and Warner Brothers and Fox, and then later United Artists and Universal. And there was always this little Disney office in Chicago or Boston or any of the cities, but they were always sort of this small. They make these animated movies, and now they are the biggest thing in the whole entertainment business because of how it evolved.
Well, if you look at Walt Disney's filmography on IMDb, he has hundreds of credits. The features, of course, stand out, and he did, I think, before he died, he had done 81 feature films, including some live-action films. But shorts, I think, were the bread and butter, weren't they, Julian? I mean, they made cartoon shorts up the yin-yang.
They certainly did. It's a great history, a great company, and I worked with Michael Eisner at Paramount, and he and Frank Wells took over a company that was reasonably dormant. It was not in great shape, and really did turn that company around. And as Arthur mentioned earlier, Bob Iger even took it further in the acquisition field more than anybody. It's interesting, you find out that Disney had this feeling, according to Neil Gabler in his book, that he was unhappy with his persona. He said, I'm no longer Walt Disney. I'm no longer that person. I'm this persona that the public have. He made that persona. He called himself Uncle Walt, or had him call Uncle Walt. But I remember being told, and I never read it, but I was told it by a man who knew him well, that he would go to children's matinees and sit with the kids to see on his films what they were responding to and what they weren't. And it reminded me of when I got to know Danny Thomas, and in Las Vegas, where he was a giant star, he would tape his whole routine and then listen and see where it worked, where it didn't work. I think the real pros, the real top people, never stop trying to hone their craft.
I could agree with that, but Walt Disney was I don't want to say a victim of his own success. He was one of the innovators with television. He came to your home every Sunday evening with The Wonderful World at Disney. And he was the host of it. And that's where the Uncle Walt persona came from.
And they introduced color television through
exactly.
In fact, that may have been the first color television I ever saw, because I remember that opening Wonderful World of Color. The idea, it's so funny, young audiences today don't realize that there was a period when television was just black and white. In fact, we used to watch our ball games in black and white. And I remember the first time I went to a ball game in a real stadium, the Coliseum, to see the Dodgers before they moved to Chavez Ravine. That grass was green.
Well, the idea that they don't realize that, they don't realize a lot of things, including the fact that televisions didn't have remotes. You had to get off your backside to change the channel or make it more bright or get the contrast better or move the ears. There were ears, they called them.
I tell you, Julian, one of the great inventions as far as my father was concerned was the muting device. So every time a commercial came on, he could mute that fakakta commercial.
The remote control revolutionized the world. It's like when in the 2,000-year-old man in Colorado asks Mel Brooks, what's the greatest invention of mankind? And he says, easy, liquid Prel. Liquid Prel, right? Well, yeah, it's in a medicine cabinet. It's made of plastic, so it falls out on the ground, and it's not broken. So nobody argues, and you just put it back in the medicine cabinet.
Disney was you talk about television. I think that the appearance of Annette Funicello as one of the Mouseketeers on the Mickey Mouse Club had a great effect on young libidos back in the 50s. And
absolutely.
all those shows, and I think we talked about a little bit about them when we did our TV Western episode, but Texas John Slaughter, the 9 Lives of Elfego Baca, the Swamp Fox, the Hardy Boys, the first time anybody took those marvelous Franklin Dixon novels and turned them into a TV show was so cool.
Yeah, well, here's a short list of the Mickey Mouse graduates. Ryan Gosling, Justin Timberlake, Kerry Russell, Britney Spears, Christine Aguilera, and, as you said, Annette Funicello. But Arthur, you and I grew up with Davy Crockett, man. Davy Crockett took over everything. Coonskin hats, the songs, everything.
Davy Crockett.
There you go. I think it was a 5-episode, probably one of the first miniseries, perhaps.
I think I read it sold 10 million records. I mean, Davy Crockett was just off the charts. And Fess Parker, I remember reading that Walt had seen him in one of my favorite science fiction films, which I've mentioned 1,000 times, Them, 1954, with the giant ants. Fess Parker had a little moment in that.
Davy Crockett became a big hit song, a big hit theme song. And if for anybody remember, the actor Joel Grey's father was a Yiddish comedian named Mickey Katz, Joel Grey's dad, and he made a parodied Davy Crockett in the song and became a big hit. Mazel Tov, David Crockett became a hit right on at that time of that. Guys, what year did Walt Disney die?
1966.
66.
And he was 65 at the time.
So today, everybody basically in the world knows the name Disney, correct? You would all agree?
One of the great brands.
Of course.
Absolutely.
It's one of the great brands of all time. So I was in Boston last week, and I was playing a game with my little granddaughter and her friends. And the game is simply logos. What are the most successful logos? And what is the most successful logo? What is the most popular logo in the world, which no one gets, and it's really pretty simple. But everybody guesses. The first time anybody guesses, they say Coca-Cola. And it's not Coca-Cola, but it's number 2. But my little granddaughter, Disney, Disney, Mickey Mouse, the whole thing. They know that is at the back of the hand. And just whatever it's worth, guys, do you know what if you had to guess, what is the most popular logo in the world? What would it be?
McDonald's?
Next.
Apple?
Nope.
How about IBM?
Mike?
was thinking Superman.
The most
the big
popular
red
logo
house.
in the world is the cross. Thank you very much.
I wouldn't go that far, but that's
Well,
okay.
it is. It's a fact.
I know.
So, so
Anyhow,
There are a
back,
few-
back
there
to
are-
the
no, but I'm just saying it's pretty
There are
interesting.
there are a few billion Muslims who might disagree with you on that.
Well, it's the most popular logo in the world. However, when you put Disney into that thing, you realize how popular it is. The Mickey Mouse is worldwide.
And we haven't talked about one of the huge, wonderful, terrific film that he made, and that was Mary Poppins. And that success of that movie was terrific. He was a producer. He knew what projects he wanted. He was not a writer. He was not a director, but he was a producer. In fact, Kurt Russell, who also, by the way, another person on the Mickey Mouse Club, said that at 15, Walt Disney came to him and said, "You're going to be a movie star. You're going to be a big movie star." I'm sure he had an enormous amount of smarts in certain areas. And as we pointed out more than once, Roy was there to help make sure he kept that boat.
Yeah, but he had the knack of knowing. He did. He understood commercial movies, commercial things. I have to tell you guys a story for the listeners. They had a movie in 1980 thereabout called Tron, Tron, which was supposed to be the biggest thing since Chopped Liver. It was going to be the greatest movie in the whole world, blah, blah, blah. So we owned the movie theaters on Martha's Vineyard. And during the summer between Memorial Day and Labor Day, we played everything. Anything that opened in New York, we would play on Martha's Vineyard because you had that crowd, Boston, New York, and all that. So everybody wanted to play Martha's Vineyard. And one day I get one of our film buyers comes in to see me and says, Disney has rejected Tron to open on the Vineyard. Well, that's interesting to me. How could anybody? They're all dying to get onto the Vineyard during the summertime. So I wound up calling their head of sales. I will not mention his name, but it was not Irving Ludwig, it was not Terry Semmel, and it was not Dick Cook, sweetheart of a guy. But anyway, so I'm talking to him, and I said, "Why would you possibly reach? What's the point?" He says, "Well, we think it's a special movie, and we don't think, we don't think it should play there, and we don't think Walt would do that. Would want to do that." Now it's 1980, and you're talking Walt Disney died in 1960. So I said, "Excuse me, did you say you don't think Walt is?" I don't get that. He said, "Well, we do things that we think Walt would do, and we don't do things that Walt wouldn't do." I said, "Well, how do you know that? I mean, he's gone, isn't he?" No, not here. He's always in our spirit. Oh, well, great, okay. So I said, "Bottom line, are you rejecting this? Because everybody plays their movies on Martha's Vineyard in the summertime." He said, "Yeah, I don't think Walt would want to do it, so I'm rejecting it." Okay, have whatever you want. That was on like a Tuesday. The movie opens on Friday, and it doesn't do business. I don't know that it died. I don't know that it was a bomb. I just know that it really didn't do business. So on Monday morning, the buyer comes in and says, "They're calling from Disney. They want to open the Vineyard immediately." So I called the sales guy. I won't mention his name. I said, so I said, "Yeah, we're ready to go. I said, "Well, here's what. It died. We can't open it." He said, why can't you open it? I said, "I heard from Walt. He said, don't do this. Not playing the Vineyard, guys." And it didn't play Martha's Vineyard.
Well, that was during the period when Disney was on the ropes, because after Walt died, there were still a few films that came out, but there was a long period of like the fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, I think Ron Miller was Walt's son, and he took over the reins of Walt Disney.
Probably son-in-law.
Son-in-law. You're right. Son-in-law, and he's the one, by the way, who invented Touchstone Pictures, because Ron Miller wanted to do more adult fare. They just didn't want to do kids' pictures. And there was, one of their first big hits in the 80s was Splash, with directed by Ron Howard, which was a huge hit for them. But before you get to Splash, you get to movies like The Black Hole and Something Wicked This Way Comes. These are huge bombs that nearly sank the studio. Thank God they had the theme parks, generating all that wonderful oil revenue, not literally oil, but like an oil well, because their movie division was really sucking wind.
They were doing movies in the 70s. Dick Bacalian became a star of those movies. Super Dad or whatever these things were.
You had like movies like Gus, the Apple Dumpling Gang.
Yes.
And then you started getting into like Flight of the Navigator, and they still put out animated films like The Rescuers or The Great Mouse Detective, excuse me.
And you can't forget Flubber. And Herbie.
Flubber, of course.
Herbie.
Of course.
Herbie,
those were like late 60s and such in that era. But it was interesting what brought, then Disney had a renaissance with their animation, starting with the little
Professor Mike.
Well, that goes back to the 50s, I think. Absent-Minded Professor, like 57 or 58.
57, 58, I think.
Walt was still around at that time. But Mike's absolutely right. The big deal was luring Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg over to Disney.
And Frank Wells.
Frank Wells from Paramount.
And literally what saved them was The Little Mermaid.
1989.
Yep. And then they had a string of hits with Little Mermaid. Then they had Lion King. Then they had Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin.
Well, by that time, you're talking a whole different ballgame. Those guys took over in 1984.
But it took time. What they originally came out with like the Rescuers Down Under, and all these different.
They had some terrific movies in the 80s.
They were live action though. They were, like I mentioned, Splash.
That's what I just said.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but we have to remember,
but it wasn't the kids' movies and stuff.
You have to remember when new management comes in, there's been stuff developed that's on its way that has nothing to do with new management. Of course,
exactly.
If it's successful, they take the total credit for it. And if it flops, they, of course, blame old management. It's a technique that's been going on in Hollywood since the beginning of time.
But also, like with Eisner and such, they also got very lucky in that era because it was also the rise of the cable industry. And, they were able to create the Disney Channel and bring back a lot of the cartoons from the 30s, 40s, 50s that, they have their own channel now. And they also made
a very strong decision to take their movies, in some cases. I think the first one was Beauty and the Beast, to Broadway, and they became billion-dollar entities. Lion King, of course, now
very much so.
That was those guys. Those guys were brilliant.
Back in '89, which is the year that the Little Mermaid kicked some butt. They had the counter programming to Batman. 1989 was all about Batman. That was the big Warner Brothers hit that year. But Disney had a movie called Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which was a huge hit. And the reason I bring it up is I was hired to do unit publicity on the sequel to Honey, I Shrunk.
Always a sequel.
Honey, exactly. Always a sequel. I worked on Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, and I had an office on the Disney lot. And if you've never worked on the Disney lot, even though I was only there a couple months, it's very special. You get to walk down Dopey Drive, and you get to hang out on Mickey Boulevard, and you walk by the old animation building, and it's like a college campus. It's the most beautiful, pristine, wonderful little lot there on Buena Vista.
Americana,
and one of my jobs, if you recall the movie, Wayne Zielinski, the hero of the first movie, who shrunk his kids down, he accidentally takes his baby and raises it to 50 feet tall. And there's a sequence, and he's walking around in his little jumper. So I got an order, and publicists get interesting orders one day. They want to put Jeffrey Katzenberg inside the pocket of the jumper. So my job was to wrangle the art crew to put the jumper up and put Jeffrey Katzenberg in the pocket of the jumper. And that was one of my favorite moments.
I'll give you a great Disney story. On that lot, there was a big party one day, and I be honest with you, I forget what it was for. One of their anniversaries. So my partner and I are out there, and I have my little daughter with me. At the time, she was maybe 5 years old. and we're talking with some of the guys, and there are these characters are all over the place. Tigger the tiger, Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse. So they're walking in their costumes. They're all around. So we're talking about stuff, and Boston comes up, and all of a sudden I hear in the background, "Are you guys from Boston?" You know, who the hell said that? I turn around, and it was Tigger. Tigger the tiger was talking to us, which they're not allowed to do. I mean, they're supposed to never, ever do that. And also the guy in his uniform was saying, "You know, I used to work in Scully Square when it was a burlesque place." He was a midget. And my daughter's having this conversation. She goes up to him and talking animatedly. And of course, one of the Disney people said, "That guy, Tigger's not supposed to talk." Like, we're very serious. But Tigger talked, and they all were human beings inside those costumes, of course.
I always felt sorry in the summer for the costume characters on the Disneyland. I just couldn't believe anybody could wear one of those hot, warm costumes when it's 95 degrees out. And I think, I hope they were unionized.
I got to know Stanley Donen, and he and Gene Kelly made a lot of movies together, as we all know. And they wanted to do a sequence in Anchors Away with a mouse. And they wanted Mickey Mouse.
Right.
So they called up Walt. They went over and said, "This is what we're going to do. We're going to, Gene's going to dance with the mouse," Stanley said. And Walt said, "He may, but he's not going to dance with Mickey. Mickey's not for sale. Mickey's not going anywhere. Mickey stays where he is." He wouldn't consider it. And Of course, they were working at MGM. So what did they do? They got Jerry of Tom and Jerry. And it's one of the most delightful sequences of dance between a mouse.
Iconic.
Yeah, right. And Stanley said, to his consternation, he was known as the mouse because he actually choreographed that particular sequence with Gene. Stanley had wonderful ideas, but he's nothing to do with Disney, so I'll turn it back to you guys.
How successful was Roger Rabbit, Steve?
Oh, it was huge success. And to this day, is a movie you could watch all over again. It's a classic. What, don't you agree, Mike?
Oh, very much so. It's truly, and it was a big deal because it just wasn't Disney characters. It was Warner Brother characters. And you also had from other studios, you even had Woody Woodpecker. You had, Heckle and Jekyll. You had all these characters. I remember when it came out, friends of mine, that's not what Bugs looks like. That's not what Mickey looks like. But if you look back, because the Robert Zemeckis, who was the director of the film, he wanted the characters to look like what they looked like in 1947, not modern times. And that was a real stroke of genius. And, it changed the industry completely because before that, they did live action and animated together for years. Look at, like you mentioned, Mary Poppins. Look at Bedknobs and Broomsticks,
The
different
incredible
films.
Mr. Limpet.
Exactly. And so you had so much, but literally Roger Rabbit took it literally to the next level. And this is still pre-CGI. Pre-CGI was still in its infancy compared to what it is now.
I have to say
it was just amazing.
One of my favorite animated films before Ed was The Jungle Book. And I think the song The Bare Necessities, sung by Louis Prima and Phil Harris, has got to be one of the greatest animated songs
It is.
ever
It's a great
performed.
song. A great
Just
song.
fantastic. Just
And
terrific.
Phil Harris, who most people don't know of, was one of the greatest showmen of all time. They hit the nail on the head with that. Guys, we briefly mentioned earlier merchandise with regard to Disney. It's incalculable to understand just how many zillions of dollars they make on the merchandise of their characters. And they were in the forefront of merch, but they weren't the first, but they were up there. And no one's taken advantage of it like them, except maybe the sports leagues. When you think about the various sports, football, baseball, basketball, They make zillions of dollars on their
look
logos.
Look what they've done. They've acquired these franchises from Marvel and from Lucasfilm, Pixar, which have their own merchandising bonanzas. So they control even more of it now. Although I have to say, just like empires that take on a little too much territory, I wonder, how well they're going to do in the future, because the Marvel universe, as we know, has begun to wane greatly. And I think that after making 100 of these movies, you wonder how much more of the Marvel universe is. And then they've definitely kind of stubbed their toe on the feature Star Wars movies. The television ones they've created for the Disney Channel have been terrific, but the Star Wars features have not been well received at all.
Well, my guess is that they'll find a way to make it work again. They can always bring those things back. There's another generation. We've seen that too many times in the past where these things come back. You want to start with Batman or Superman? They were thought to be dead too, but they'll figure it out. They've got very, very bright people. Disney is as well run an organization as there is in the world, probably, let alone in the industry.
I should mention that, since I'll throw in my James Bond reference, which I do weekly, the reason that Sean Connery came to the James Bond world of Albert R. Broccoli was that Mrs. Broccoli was watching a Disney movie called Darby O'Gill and the Little People, 1959. And there's a two-fisted Scotsman in that movie named Sean Connery, who kind of mesmerized her and brought her to the she brought him to the attention of Cubby Broccoli, and the rest, of course, is history.
There's no question, and I don't think there ever was a Bond that came close to him. For me, I just thought he was.
Well, there wasn't. He was
personification.
No, he was the man, and of course, I certainly know that because I've been writing about him for 40 years.
Let's go back to Mary Poppins for a minute. A perfect movie. Didn't miss 1 second of perfection. We would all agree with that. Songs, the music.
Loved it. And we didn't mention Lady and the Tramp.
Yeah.
Lady and the Tramp. I mean,
I am Siamese, if I please. Remember the little song?
I am Siamese, if you don't please. And that was Peggy Lee, I think. I think Peggy Lee may have written that song. I'm not sure, but I think so.
That movie sold a lot of spaghetti, I'll tell you.
There was a great story that I was told by a wonderful guy named Dwight Hemian, who I've mentioned before on this program. Dwight was the king of directing specials, Barbra Streisand, Frank Sinatra, in the days of the specials, early 1960s, 70s. And they did a special one time on Disney and they went to the lot and oh, God. And he tells a story of the host of the show was Danny Kaye, who we all remember as the sweetest, dearest person. Talk about, different kind of personalities, dual personalities. But apparently he wasn't really that way. Apparently he was not the sweetest man in the world. I say this from hearsay, but I heard it from a lot of people. Anyway, they're doing a show, and as Danny Kaye is talking directly to the camera about what this show is about and all that, all of a sudden Dwight says, "You have to cut." And Danny Kaye says, "Cut what? Why? It was perfect." No. There's a little car that came by, a little one of those like golf carts, and with this little lady in it. And Danny said, "What?" And he turns around, and he sees the cart with the lady, and he goes running after the cart, screaming curse words all over the place. "You stupid woman! How could you blew the shot?" Well, he was really some foul language. And Dwight, who knew all about Danny, went up to him and said, "Danny, you may be amazed to know that little lady was Mrs. Walt Disney." And Danny Kaye was dying. "Oh my God!" He went running after her. "I'm sorry, I never said what I said."
I was interested in knowing. I don't know if you guys read about this. That Disney loved trains. He loved them, and in his mansion, his home, he had accordingly, or what I read, a half a mile of train track. That's how big his home was in there, and a 90-foot tunnel. So this was a man who I think in his early years probably had a great love for trains and kept it right through his...
And obviously remained a big kid inside himself.
You know that the first thing he probably ordered for Disneyland was the train tracks that circled the land.
Yeah.
Now I read, here's an interesting fact. The Walt Disney won more Oscars than anybody in history. I think way more than, I think that John Williams, has been nominated 50 times, but I think Walt has won 70 Oscars or something like that. But the Walt Disney Company, as of 2024, has never won a Best Picture award. So they are...
As of what date, Steve?
As of today,
They have never won?
They've never won a Best Picture award. Mary Poppins was nominated for Best Picture in '64, but it picked the wrong year to do it because that was the year of My Fair Lady.
Well, there's no question that that was the irony, the fact that Julie Andrews was in Mary Poppins, but she had starred on Broadway, but they wouldn't give her the role in My Fair Lady.
Right. Well, she got her revenge the following year because she won the Oscar for Best Actress in The Sound of Music.
Did Sound of Music win for Best Picture?
Yep.
Yeah.
Best Picture of 1965. Well deserved.
Yeah.
And that 20th Century Fox, so nothing to do with Disney.
It was funny, Steve Areno, when we talked about sex goddesses last week, and you mentioned Julie Andrews from one of the movies that she is, SOB or something.
Americanization of Emily and SOB, but SOB, she went topless. But
really, with all due respect, I don't think she was a sex symbol.
I agreed. Even when I mentioned it, they that didn't quite.
Great lady.
I'll tell you who was a sex symbol. It was the rabbit, Jessica Rabbit in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. If there ever was a sex symbol, it was Jessica Rabbit. And I think Kathleen Turner, if I'm not mistaken, did her voice.
That's correct.
For the speaking voice, but Amy Irving was the singing voice.
Oh,
actually.
Wow.
Oh, little she married coming in there.
And I think
a little bit of trivia there.
I think Charles Fleischer, if I'm not mistaken, was Roger. Wasn't that correct?
He was.
Along the lines of what this show is all about, let's think for just one moment of what the heck would the world be without Walt Disney? Wow.
A much unhappier place.
Yeah.
Well,
much unhappier place, yes.
Steve mentions Jessica Rabbit as a pretty hot thing. And Arthur, aren't we involved with something like that next week?
We're involved we're involved with gangster movies. That's what we're on. Not like that, but we're here to talk on Tales from Hollywoodland. We're going to be talking about great gangster movies. Godfather, Casino, Miller's Crossing. There's a little one that not too many people have seen.
I just want to know who's going to do the impression of Edward G. Robinson. I just want to know who.
You can do that. Let's hear it.
Dirty rat.
Yeah, where's your Moses now? Yeah.
Where's your Moses now? We should probably talk about what's coming up on our other podcasts. Julian, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, this Wednesday we have the writer, actor, and director Alan Alda will be on from MASH fame and many other things.
Fabulous.
And his father was Robert.
Robert
Alda.
That's right.
And
how about you, Steve Areno?
Douglas Day Stewart, the screenwriter of An Officer and a Gentleman, is my guest. And I just discovered, it was announced in the trades today, that Paramount is developing a sequel based on Douglas's new novel, which takes the story. It's called An Officer and a Gentleman's Daughter. So, in fact, Miles Teller of Whiplash has been announced as the star. He's going to play the Richard Gere character.
Who had the hit record of the great song from Officer and a Gentleman, Steve?
I don't remember.
Joe Cocker.
Great
Joe
song.
Cocker and Jennifer Warnes.
Yeah.
And Mike, why don't you take us out, Mike?
Yes, sir. Thanks for listening to the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you guys, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland.com. Remember, you could also find Tales from Hollywoodland wherever fine podcasts are found. And now you could find us up on our new YouTube channel at no extra cost. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? If you're into social media, please check us out on Instagram and Facebook. On behalf of myself, Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber. We'll see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts right here.
Love music from rock to soul, from prog to rap, from funk to metal, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now? Then check out Modern Musicology Podcast. Join hosts Alan, Stephanie, Anthony, and Rob for a wide variety of topic discussions and interviews with musicians, producers, authors, and more. As always, keep rocking on.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.